والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala that in these blessed days we gather to read Professor Said Muhammad Nakib Al-Atas's Islam and Secularism. And inshallah, today we will read his preface to the second printing. As we know, the first print of Islam and Secularism was published in 1978, and in his Malay work called Risalah untuk kaum Muslimin, epistle to the Muslims, which was dictated in 1973 but published in 2001, he mentioned that most of the contents of Islam and Secularism had in germinal form already been written in the Risalah in 1973. And there's a chapter which is Islam, the concept of religion and the foundation of ethics and morality, which was written in 1976 and read at the Muslim World Conference on Art. But the other chapters were developed and published in 1978, especially the first two, which I think is a very important landmark contribution by a Muslim scholar on the study of the development of secularization and secularism as an ideology and as a philosophical program in the West, and how it can affect Islam. And then he added another chapter, the fourth chapter, which is the Muslim dilemma, in which he traces how secularism and secularization as a philosophical program entered into the minds of the Muslims. So therefore, this basic, and mind you, 1978 was also about the same year that Edward Said's Orientalism was published. Yes. So while Islam and secularism may be less well known to Western audiences, but scholars amongst them have read and have benefited immensely from it, one of which is Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf, but also many other diligent scholars. Because while the book might not have been as well cited as it ought to have been, but Professor Nakib Al-Atas is quite well known among Western scholars, especially scholars of religious studies and Islam in particular. That is because in the days where he used to direct and found his time. So during the days of his time, there was at least two major conferences, one of which was Islam and Modernity, or Islam and the Challenge in Modernity, 1994, and the other was the conference on Imam Al-Ghazali, on the thought of Imam Al-Ghazali. And in these two conferences, you find great names of Islamic studies. Anne-Marie Shimel came, as well as Jabir Iqbal, the son of Allama Iqbal, he came too. And also Professor Hussein Nasser had come to his institute. Professor Fazlur Rahman was invited to ISTAC, but unfortunately he passed away in 1987, just as ISTAC was in its nascent stages. So you can see that therefore the great names of Islamic thought in the 20th century, most of them would have heard of ISTAC. And in their journal, which they established, Shajara, great names in Islamic thought, be it in Islamic philosophy, theology, have all published with the journal. So it goes without saying that Al-Atas is known, but at the same time is not known. Yes. And the same can be said of his reputation locally, that amongst the great scholars they knew him, but amongst the generality of the society they might not know him like that. Walhasil, Sheikh Hamzah Yusuf once did an interview with Sayyid Nakib Al-Atas, and in the interview he said that if scholars were to do their archaeology of knowledge in the 20th century, they will come at the bedrock of Sayyid Nakib Al-Atas for most of the important ideas. One of the most significant ones is his conception of the West and his definition of the West, and his outlining of the cause of secularism, secularization. Yes. While in the chapter on secularization, as he skimmed through from Aristotle to the Cartesian revolution of the 17th century, he did mention that he benefited from the account given in a more elaborate setting by Hussein Nasr, but you can see that there are some significant differences in their conception of what led to the secularization process. In particular, Al-Atas's main thesis about secularization is that the roots of secularization in the West is in the adaptation of the methodology and metaphysics of Greek philosophy into Christianity. And that led to this full-fledged secularization in the medieval centuries, until eventually the dualism can no longer be contained, until it led to the materialization, secularization as we understand today. So today, inshallah, we will try and read from the preface to the second printing, which was already during the period that he was director of ISTAC. This second edition was published in 1998, which already means that it was after the Prolegomena to the metaphysics of Islam. And then, or rather, it is said here that the second impression in this text is 1993, but the chapters in the Prolegomena were already written as monographs and published. And he was already giving the Saturday night lectures and elaborating on some of the themes already. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Almost 20 years have elapsed since the first printing of this book, but the seminal ideas pertaining to the problem of Muslim education and allied topics of an intellectual and revolutionary nature, such as the idea of Islamization of contemporary knowledge, and a general definition of its nature and method, and the idea of the Islamic University, the conceptualization of its nature, and final establishment, were formulated much earlier in the mid-1960s. They were formulated, elaborated, and disseminated here in Malaysia and abroad in academic lectures and various conferences and more than 400 public lectures, and were born out of the need for creative thinking and clarification of the basic concepts based upon the religious and intellectual tradition of Islam, and upon personal observation and reflection and conceptual analysis throughout my teaching experience in Malaysian universities since 1964. These ideas have also been communicated to the Islamic Secretariat in Jeddah in early 1973, at the same time urging the relevant authorities to convene a gathering of reputable scholars of Islam to discuss and deliberate upon them. There is no doubt that these ideas have been instrumental in the convening of the first World Conference on Muslim Education held at Mecca in 1977, where the substance of chapter 5 of this book was published in English and Arabic and read as a keynote address at the plenary session. In 1980, a commentary of a few paragraphs of that chapter pertaining to the concept of education in Islam was presented and read as a keynote address at the plenary session of the Second World Conference on Muslim Education held at Islamabad early the same year. Thenceforth, for the successive convenings of the World Conference on Muslim Education held in various Muslim capital cities, I was not invited. And my ideas have been appropriated without the acknowledgement and propagated since 1982 by ambitious scholars, activists, academic operators, and journalists in vulgarized forms to the present day. Muslims must be warned that plagiarists and pretenders, as well as ignorant imitators, effect great mischief by debasing values, imposing upon the ignorant, and encouraging the rise of mediocrity. They appropriate original ideas for hasty implementation and make false claims for themselves. Original ideas cannot be implemented when vulgarized. On the contrary, what is praiseworthy in them will turn out to become blameworthy, and their rejection will follow with the dissatisfaction that will emerge. So in this way, authentic and creative intellectual effort will continually be sabotaged. It is not surprising that the situation arising out of the loss of adab also provides the breeding ground for the emergence of extremists who make ignorance their capital. Since the value and validity of new ideas can best be developed and clarified along logical lines by the original source. I have, by means of my own thought, initiative, and creative effort, and with God's succor and the aid of those whom God has guided to render their support, conceived and established an international institute aligned to the purpose of the further development, clarification, and correct implementation of these ideas until they may come to full realization. So we have now Professor Nagib Alatas giving us a brief history of Islamic thought in the 20th century. But in the book, we will find that he's traced the crisis of Muslim civilization internally much earlier. Of course, he may have mentioned that some scholars of the 12th century Miladi and slightly earlier, some of whom have criticized the ulama of the madhahib in the past, some of whom have criticized what to their minds were excesses in tasawwuf amongst the orders, some of whom were critical of the theologians, including, of course, the logicians amongst the theologians. And so some 18th century scholar and his students took as their inspiration such earlier scholars, their spirit of attacking great ulama of the past. Now, the result of this rise of this new movement, let us say, into history, a sort of projection of a puritanical understanding of Islam unto the past. They are claiming to be of the Salaf, the pious predecessors. This was the cause of the epistemic corruption from within the Islamic intellectual tradition. So, coupled with the problem of secularization introduced chiefly by the West through colonial means, but also through the disintegration of Islamic institutions. Because as we know, in terms of the background of Islamic societies, what had happened in the early modern period onwards was the progressive degeneration of the institutions. We know, for example, in the Indian Ocean, in the Malay archipelago in particular, that two means through which the scholars affected the general public was one of which is through the courts. Yes, through the courts and the kings and the sultans. So some of them may hold special positions, like Sheikh Nuruddin Al-Raniri of Sumatra. He used to be the Sheikhul Islam of Aceh. So through the court, yes, and through the support of the Sultan, he may initiate debates and Islamization missions, send works of his original contribution to the rest of the archipelago. The other main channel through which scholars affected the general public was through the network of scholarship that was available through trade and pilgrimage, that the scholars would gather in Makkah during the period of Hajj and exchange ideas. And students of knowledge likewise would spend many years in the centers of education. And the Muslim nations know amongst themselves which centers are the places of learning through which they communicated with each other, and then gradually it permeated to the general public. In the Malay archipelago, we have the system of the pondok, where you'd have the alim who, in his own studies, would have gone through the curriculum in Makkah or in Zabid or in Hadramaut in the Arabic language. But when they teach the general public, yes, or the more discerning amongst the general public, they will use the Jawi texts. So you see this system was eventually being challenged by the movements of the so-called reformers. Yes, and these reformers initially had an internal engine, as we said just now, deriving from the scholars of earlier times. Yes, those who attacked the predecessors, but gradually with the eventual effect of colonization and the disintegration of the institutions, eventually some of these scholars, the so-called second phase of reformism, took on modernistic traits. Yes, such that they tried to reform the interpretations. Yes, they tried for taqlid. They tried for ijtihad, the interpretation of the texts in order to fit with the spirit of the times. This, while at the same time, colonialism created a new breed of intellectuals. Yes, and these are basically the Western educated ones. Yes, what we call the secular educated scholars, who might have a strong propensity towards the religion, but possess neither the tools to understand Islamic civilization or the Western civilization. So they become a new breed of people, intellectuals. Yes. So now we have the traditionalist reformers, and then you have the modernist reformers, and then thirdly you have secular intellectuals. So these, amongst these three, they created a condition of what is called corruption of knowledge, according to Sayyidina Ibn Abbas. Now, this would then continue from the 19th to the 20th centuries. And imagine how, when most of the Muslim world would have been colonized, and then gradually some of which gained their independence, but the systems would have been in place. Yes, the education systems would have been in place. So, so when Professor Naguib Al-Attas returned to the country, yes, as he said here in 1963, which means that it was, for Malaysia at least, just 6 years out of independence. And 6 years out of independence. And for him, he had just written his doctoral thesis, which was published in 1962 by the National University on the mysticism of Hamzah Pansuri. But because there wasn't yet a Department of Islamic Studies, they put him as a lecturer in Malay studies as a language, even though he was awarded his PhD in Islamic philosophy, metaphysics, and theology, Tarim, Tasawwuf, Falsafah. Yes, at SOAS. Yes. So he gave lectures around the country, and he had already written a letter to the secretary of the OIC, yes, which happened to be the Prime Minister of Malaysia at that period, who was soliciting advice from the Muslims about what is the problem with the Muslim nations really. So some gave certainly their opinions about the political struggles. Some were just fresh out of independence. Others talked about the economic station, technological backwardness, and so on and so forth. But Sayyidina Naguib Al-Attas was, in his penetrating insight, saw that those were just symptoms, yes, but rather the cause was knowledge, and something needed to be done. So that's why in the opening lines, he spoke about, yes, the problem of Muslim education, yes, the Islamization of contemporary knowledge, yes, and a general definition of its nature and method, and the idea of the Islamic university. You can imagine how revolutionary these ideas were, how important these were. Yes, because while before the independence, or rather, while historically we've always had institutions of learning in Islam, the madrasa, the jamia, yes, but the conception of an Islamic university, as he had in mind, would truly address the problem. Because while the jamia and the madrasas continued along the same lines, some of which were undergoing reform in India particularly, yes, like after Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, Sheikh Waliullah Dahlawi, and also the modernists also, they tried. I mean, a lot of activity was happening in modern India that tried to address the modern and the current needs. In particular, I think Sheikh Waliullah's Hujjatullah Al-Balighah, that was trying to address the metaphysical problems of the present times. But I remember, as Professor Wan was saying, that some of about the traditional scholars was that they've always had access to true knowledge, and this true knowledge is akin to a medicine that is like a panacea that can solve any problems. However, the proper diagnosis of the present problems is needed before you can give the right dosage and the right kind of treatment, even though you may have the best medicine. Yes. So while, for example, tasawwuf, kalam, or rather tasawwuf, aqidah, and fiqh, this is the ilmul matlub. But on the other hand, you have to understand what is preventing people from arriving at the ilmul matlub. So that's why, in the 17th or 18th centuries, criticizing Aristotle would just not do anymore. Yes, and criticizing the Greeks, yes, especially in their metaphysics, pure metaphysics would not do anymore, because the Western people themselves, they have moved on from that train of thought. You need to do an update, basically, of an understanding of the Cartesian problem, and then the problems of the new challenge. According to Al-Atas, what Imam Al-Ghazali have written in the Tahafat al-Falasifa was already sufficient for Al-Ghazali to vanquish the problem of the Hellenistic philosophers, the Neoplatonic Aristotelians. It was sufficient. But in its new guise, basically the West itself has underwent change. It's no longer Aristotelian in the basic sense. They have now taken, humanistic characteristics, tragic characteristics. They have now secularized themselves. Even in terms of their basic conception of being, they are no longer Aristotelians. As the Greeks understood nature primarily in spatial terms. They understood nature primarily in spatial terms, and their conception of ethics is largely drawn from their aesthetics experience. Yes, so to be good is also to be beautiful, like that. But in the modern secular West, this is the effect of Judaism, rather. As the collapse, the dualism between the two led to the Judaic conception of reality, in particular the temporal notion of reality. Yes, so this is something that a criticism of Aristotle would not do anymore. Basically, to understand modern metaphysics is to be able to understand the temporal notion, historicism, evolutionism, the notion that everything is changing, and the realm of change is not metaphysical change. Again, what is available in your toolbox to criticize, for example, even in terms of the West, they've gone past the Aristotelian notion of change. The Aristotelian notion of change, if you can understand it, while he speaks of corruption and generation, it's still understood as if time was broken to some sort of an indivisible unit, like that, and the focus is still on corruption and change at that level. But the modern historicist experience, yes, as summarized in the Hegelian understanding of dialectic, understands the nature of definitions to be continuously at the level of being unraveled. Yes, and this also became the basis of Comte's notion of positivism. Yes, the focus on the here and now. So once you understand this dynamic process, it is also subtly merged with their notion of humanism. Yes, meaning to say man as the source of right and wrong, as ethics. And also, while change was the major constituent of reality, that change was also identified with the theology of progress. Yes. What is theology of progress? It has nothing to do with theos anymore. Yes, it uses the word theology, but it's no longer, the subject matter is no longer God. Yes. What basically they mean by the theology of progress is the belief in some better future. Yes, some better future. It is in the realm of the here and now. Meaning to say, what they have done is to understand the Judaic vision of some beautiful future to no longer be about a time which is higher in realm. Yes, it is not to survive the world and to be resurrected in the Akhirah, which is in a different time. It is now in this time. Yes, so they pursue this relentlessly. Now, therefore, in trying to criticize Western knowledge and in trying to Islamize knowledge, you will require a more dynamic understanding, in fact, a restatement of Islamic metaphysics that can deal with this. And that is why the ultimate answer that Sayyid Nagib al-Atas gave to the problem of metaphysics. I remember some of our lecturers used to say that he kept his silver bullet, or his final bullet, for the prolegomena to the metaphysics of Islam, because he answered the problem of Western dualism, Western metaphysics, in his commentary on the 6 days of creation. It's in the Islamic understanding of this dynamic reality, in Islamic understanding of existence. Yes, because the problem with Western metaphysics that started with Aristotle was that reality was reduced to the mental notion of it. And the mental notion of it, which is already a freezed picture of something, yes, that freezed picture of something is of a lower category compared to what reality is. So therefore, when they speak about existence, being per se, to be something external to ourselves, what is not known, yes, what was not known, which can't then later figure out, is that you're not really speaking about reality. You're speaking about the goggles that you have that speak about reality. For Kant, what is reality? The reality is unknown. It's beyond the human ken. Yes, Kant called this the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Yes, because he understood that rather than your mind is can describe reality, rather reality is reality because it is the particular one that your mind can conceive. What the noumena is, yes, is unknown. What you experience is but the phenomenon. So, but the Kantian evolution or revolution, we say, the ultimate end of that would be postmodernism. Ultimately, they will be led to this skepticism where nothing can be affirmed. The collapse of the meta-narrative. There is no meta-narrative. The death of the author also. That's the most painful. Yes, because in literature, what the death of the author meant that as soon as a person publishes a text, yes, even the author of the text cannot say what the meaning of the text is. Yes. So meaning to say that where the interpretation of things goes, you know, that there are no meta-narratives. Yes, so everything returns to the beholder, and everything is in this great relativistic fashion. It's fine as a literary play, isn't it? It's fine as a work of fiction. But if ethics is subject to that, if metaphysics is subject to that, if religion is subject to that, that leads to the collapse of society. However, now how does Alatas solve this problem? Is because the vision, yes, of reality and truth that is projected by the Quran is not purely the product of the human mind. Yes, it's not purely the product of the human mind. We affirm that knowledge, as in the Quran, is revealed by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, and that it can be confirmed by religion and intuition and intuitive principles. And this is the basis of metaphysics in Islam. And he outlined, therefore, the metaphysics of tasawwuf to be this grounding principle for Islam. So he wrote the prolegomena to the metaphysics of Islam for the teachers, he said. Of course, maybe not kindergarten teachers, yes, not even primary school teachers, but ulama ultimately, meaning people who understood both the Islamic civilization and its sciences, and those who are trying to understand the modern West. Yes, but in Islam and secularism, he outlines basically the project, but in more germinal forms. You will find all the major ideas already now situated. But here it is equivalent to the Maqasid al-Falasifa of Imam al-Ghazali, and the tahafut is done in the prolegomena. But you can see also here criticisms and an outline of the problems of metaphysics. So what did he propagate? He suggested that you must Islamize knowledge. Now, just based on on what we have discussed the past 10 minutes or so about Western metaphysics and Islamic metaphysics, certainly now Islamization of knowledge is not something simple, isn't it? It's not. Some of them, they try to caricature Islamization of knowledge. Like amongst the Malaysian journalists, they say, "Oh, what next? Are we going to have Islamic cars, Islamic bottles?" Yes, and so on. Meaning to say, they think that to make something Islamic. And so that's why some of them, they try to correct the grammar. They say it's not Islamization; it should be Islamicization, making something Islamic. But the grammatical structures aside, what he means by Islamization is not putting on things of the apparent type. Yes, it's not just making things Islamic by putting on the accidents of Islamic civilization upon it. Yes, the accidents of Islamic culture upon it, because he has an explanation also of what Islamic civilization means. An Islamic civilization or a culture is a culture or a civilization, yes, in which the peoples forming the culture, their minds have been permeated by the worldview, the elements of the worldview of Islam, and thereby they produce their culture, they produce their civilization as a result of having their minds permeated through language, the worldview of Islam. So whatever is produced is Islamic, isn't it? Islamic architecture, Islamic clothing, manufacturing, all of that is Islamic. But you can detach the Islamic, the metaphysics, and it would still produce things like that. Yes. So that is not Islamization, therefore. As the Islamization is in the person, Islamization is through the language, Islamization is in the metaphysics and ethics. Yes. So those who caricature, yes, as he said, did so because of the role of the plagiarists, those who misunderstood it, those who took the ideas to be their own, whereas they have not fully understood it. Yes, these are, as he said, the academic operators, the journalists, and people of ambitious scholars. Yes, and he gave in the footnote examples of some of these scholars who, tried to claim the ideas as their own, and then tried to develop their own methodology, despite their brilliance in other matters. But because they misunderstood this, or because they tried to fit it within the, let us say, within the puritanical metaphysics, which in itself is a corruption, you cannot achieve the full effects of Islamization of knowledge. So now, Al-Atas has said that why he's trying to explain these things, Islamization of knowledge, the content of education, and then the Islamic university. These are all very fundamental ideas, and if we follow this line of thinking properly, yes, from the attempts of reformism, yes, it is not that scholars in the 18th century and the 17th century, the true inheritors of the true prophetic inheritors, were not brilliant, but it is just that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decided to give this proper understanding of the West maybe later. However, if we follow the line of thought, we would understand that this is exactly what the Muslim world needs. Yes, this is exactly what the Muslim world needs, and this is exactly what would address the problem. Because the West, the modern West, has developed a mechanism, a system, in which all the institutions, one after the other, are interrelated. Yes, and the instrument through which all the institutions are nourished is the education system. Yes, and the education system, with the health system, and all these other systems in the modern nation state, they are all interrelated in such a way that if you understood the root of the modern West in terms of its power as being rooted in its conception of knowledge, that's exactly the place that you need to change it. As that's where you need to address the problem. And if you Islamize knowledge of that nature, and then you conceive of the sort of institution through which this can happen, it will resolve the problem of the Muslims. Yes. In theory, it sounds easy. Yes. Or rather, in theory, it sounds like this is exactly what we need. But of course, it seems like the distance between mathematics and, say, applied engineering, there's a great distance. I mean, in definition, we say that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Yes, but in traveling, you never get straight lines. Yes, isn't it? In engineering, you don't get straight lines, and in society, you get even further away. Yes, because there's quarrels, there's so many things that will come into practice before you can achieve that. So what has it? Why is it that it is important that he wrote the second preface? Yes, he wanted to say, not that he's trying to claim originality, even though it is his right, even though it is right to acknowledge a person for something that Allah has given him. But precisely because of what the right, because of what the Ummah deserves, because the Ummah deserves proper and right thinking. Yes, and the Ummah deserves the proper version of the solution to their problems. The International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, although formulated and conceptualized much earlier, was officially opened in 1991. And amongst its most important aims and objectives are to conceptualize, clarify, elaborate scientific and epistemological problems encountered by Muslims in the present age. That's the first hadaf, yes? Which is to conceptualize, clarify, elaborate scientific and epistemological problems encountered by Muslims in the present age. It is the new Kitabul Ilm in that sense, yes? But made in motion. And then to provide an Islamic response to the intellectual and cultural challenges of the modern world and various schools of thought, religion and ideology. To formulate an Islamic philosophy of education, including the definition, aims and objectives of Islamic education. To formulate an Islamic philosophy of science. To study the meaning and philosophy of Islamic art and architecture. And to provide guidance for the Islamization of the arts and art education. To publish the results of our researches and studies from time to time for dissemination in the Muslim world. To establish a superior library reflecting the religious and intellectual traditions, both of the Islamic and Western civilizations, as a means to attaining the realization of the above aims and objectives. Those with understanding and discernment will know, when they ponder over the significance of these aims and objectives, that these are not merely empty slogans. For they will realize that these aims and objectives reflect a profound grasp of the real problems confronting the contemporary Muslim world. The aims and objectives of the Institute are by no means easy to accomplish, but with concerted effort from dedicated and proven scholars who will deliberate as a sort of organic body, which is itself rooted in authentic Islamic learning, and are at the same time able to teach various modern disciplines, we shall, God willing, realize the fulfillment of our vision. Even so, a significant measure of these aims and objectives has in fact already been realized in various stages of fulfillment. Concise books have already been published by ISTAC outlining frameworks for Islamic philosophy of education, including its definition and its aims and objectives, of science, of psychology and epistemology, as well as other works which altogether will be integrated to project what I believe to be the worldview of Islam. It is within the framework of this worldview, formulated in terms of a metaphysics, that our philosophy of science and our sciences in general must find correspondence and coherence with truth. ISTAC has already begun operating as a graduate institution of higher learning open to international scholars and students engaged in research and studies on Islamic theology, philosophy and metaphysics, science, civilization, languages and comparative thought and religion. It has already assembled a respectable and noble library reflecting the fields and compassing its aims and objectives, and the architecture of its ISTAC itself is a concrete manifestation of artistic expression that springs from the well of creative knowledge. SubhanAllah. Yes. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed for Professor Al-Atas to found and direct and lead this institution for nearly 15 years, from 1987 to around 2002. And what he said, these are not exaggerations. These are in fact, based on the publications, based on the scholars and their memoirs, which were later written, their memories during their times teaching here, which was assembled in a fashrift dedicated to Professor Naqib Al-Atas, published in 2010. You will find that this sort of just how he understood Islamization of knowledge is to take place. That it cannot just be done by anyone, isn't it? It has to be done by a person who understood Islamic metaphysics as the basis of all actions. And this kind of thinking as metaphysics is in line with the sort of tradition that has developed in the Islamic intellectual tradition. You see the mutakallimin, the Sufis, as well as the as well as the hukama. They, in the past, they wrote, they wrote works in which they gather all these disciplines into a piece of writing, the metaphysics, like that, like the book of Najat of Ibn Sina, and Imam Al-Ghazali in his Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad, and Abdul Rahman Jami in the Durratul Fakhir. What they assemble in their writings is a metaphysical basis for everything. And this metaphysical basis would certainly begin with theology, yes, al-ilahiyat. And of course, in the Kalamic arrangement, it would be inclusive of the nubuwat and the sam'iyat. But also they would include sections on knowledge, yes, like in the Mawaqif of Al-Iji. So you would have a section on knowledge. You would have a section on the world and the relationship of Allah to the world. And then you would have a discussion on basically the maratibul ilm. That's basically the classification of the sciences and knowledge, one after the other, so that you will see the relationship, yes, in the epistemic map, yes, in the map of knowledge, the relationship between one science and the other. And so you will know what needs to be changed, and at what level, if you were to conduct Islamization of knowledge from this very powerful basis. On the other hand, if you do not have the metaphysical framework, yes, Islamization would be a haphazard sort of thing. Yes, where you find a verse of Quran here, and then you try to square it with certain practices in management, in whatever it is that field that you happen to be in, and try to fit it within a false mold like that. And the basis of of metaphysics, yes, what we call the hikmah nadariyah. Hikmah nadariyah would become the basis of the hikmah amaliyah. Yes, theoretical wisdom, yes, is the basis of practical wisdom. So ethics, politics, and economics falls under the basis of metaphysics. And the ihya is also structured like that. Yes, the kitabul ilm, and then the aqidah, and then everything proceeds from that. Yes, of course, Imam Al-Ghazali expands on the ibadat, and he expands on the adat. Basically, the ethics is the major content of the work. Yes, and you find the Prophet Muhammad's character in the middle of the book. Yes, but the whole structure of the work, yes, proceeds from the theology, like that. So this is the sort of original thinking that the Muslim community needs, isn't it? The one that starts at the basis of the root of all the problems, and to solve it there, yes, to solve it systematically. That eventually, as he said, this is not the actions of a person who suffers from panic attacks, or from like a messiah complex, the world is going to end and I have to change everything. No, this is a person who plans things through, even while acknowledging that there are problems, yes, political or otherwise. He understood that you need to. He said that they will publish their works from time to time for dissemination. For most of the time, what do the scholars do? They contemplate, they think, they discuss, they develop themselves. Yes, that's the sort of thing that will truly change society, not the sort of reactionary measures that we have now been accustomed to for the past 200 years. This sort of activism that challenges things piecemeal, that tries to change things by resulting to uncomfortable partnerships with those who you only have a sort of minor agreement of a particular issue, and so on and so forth. So therefore, ISTAC, yes, has its aim at the highest levels that it tries to solve for the Muslim community. This book was originally dedicated to the emergent Muslims, for whose hearing and understanding it was indeed meant, in the hope that they would be intelligently prepared when their time comes to weather with discernment the pestilential winds of secularization, and with courage to create necessary changes in the realm of our thinking that is still floundering in the sea of bewilderment and self-doubt. The secularizing values and events that have been predicted would happen in the Muslim world have now begun to unfold with increasing momentum and persistence, due still to the Muslims' lack of understanding of the true nature and implications of secularization as a philosophical program. It must be emphasized that our assault on secularism is not so much directed towards what is generally understood as secular Muslim state and government, but more towards secularization as a philosophical program. which secular, in quote marks, secular Muslim states and governments did not necessarily have to adopt. The common understanding among Muslims, no doubt, indoctrinated by Western notions, is that a secular state is a state that is not governed by the ulama, or whose legal system is not established upon the revealed law. In other words, it is not a theocratic state. But this setting in contrast the secular state with the theocratic state is not really an Islamic way of understanding the matter. For since Islam does not involve itself in the dichotomy between the sacred and the profane, how then can it set in contrast the theocratic state with the secular state? An Islamic state is neither wholly theocratic nor wholly secular. A Muslim state calling itself secular does not necessarily have to oppose religious truth and religious education, but does not necessarily have to divest nature of spiritual meaning, does not necessarily have to deny religious values and virtues in politics and human affairs. But the philosophical and scientific process, which I call secularization, necessarily involves the divesting of spiritual meaning from the world of nature, the desacralization of politics from human affairs, and the deconsecration of values from the human mind and conduct. Remember that we are a people neither accustomed nor permitted to lose hope and confidence, so that it is not possible for us simply to do nothing but wrangle among ourselves and rave about empty slogans and negative activism, while letting the real challenge of the age engulf us without positive resistance. The real challenge is intellectual in nature, and the positive resistance must be mounted from the fortification not merely of political power, but of power that is founded upon right knowledge. We are now again at the crossroads of history. An awareness of Islamic identity is beginning to dawn in the consciousness of emergent Muslims. Only when this awareness comes to full awakening, with the sun of knowledge, will there emerge from among us men and women of spiritual and intellectual maturity and integrity, who will be able to play their role with wisdom and justice in upholding the truth. Such men and women will know that they must return to the early masters of the religious and intellectual tradition of Islam, which was established upon the sacred foundation of the Holy Quran and the tradition of the Holy Prophet, in order to learn from the past and be able to equip spiritually and intellectually for the future. They will realize that they must not simply appropriate and imitate what modern secular Western civilization has created, but must regain, by exerting their own creative knowledge, will and imagination, what is lost of the Muslims' purpose in life, their history, their values and virtues embodied in their sciences. For what is lost can never be regained by blind imitation and the raving of slogans which deafen with the din of development. They will discern that development must not involve a correspondence of Islam with the facts of contemporary events that have strayed far from the path of truth, and they will conceive and formulate their own definitions and conceptions of government and of the nature of development that will correspond with the purpose of Islam. Their emergence is conditional not merely upon physical struggle, but more upon the achievement of true knowledge, confidence, and boldness of vision that is able to create great changes in history. Sayyid Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas, Kuala Lumpur, 27th of Muharram, 1414, 17th of July, 1993. So we have here the discussion of the secularization as a philosophical program, which is different from secularism as a philosophical ideology that is held on to by a state. Yes. Secularization as a philosophical program has as its content, as he mentioned here, first and foremost, the disenchantment of nature. Yes, the disenchantment of nature, as defined by Max Weber. The idea that nature is stripped bare of anything metaphysical, and furthermore, it is the defatalization of history. In other words, to remove fate from the notion of history, that there is no higher world, higher realm to which everything there is an end to. Yes, basically, it is the removal of the notions of qada wal qadar, yes, in history. It is also the where man is concerned, it is man left with the world in his hands, and man left with his fate in his hands. So that's disenchantment of nature. Yes, where disenchantment is concerned, of course, you may imagine, since it is always, when we say secularization, it is secularization out of something, isn't it? Something that was but no longer is. So certainly there will be vestiges of that. Yes, the vestiges will be found in language, the vestiges will be found in institutions, which then takes a different guise this vestigiality, yes, like in biology, we understand it to be, loss of some ancestral function. Like in the kiwi bird, the wings now you cannot fly anymore. It's still there. The penguin is still a bird, but it's now being used for swimming like that. So it loses that function. So the vestiges of the theological conception, the theological worldview of the West, will be found in things such as statements when they say act of God, or physically in terms of the churches, which may remain. But it is in society, it is more like the Cheshire Cat's grain. Yes, the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Yes, yes, the cat's gone, but the grain remains like that. So religion, I think, perhaps one of the poets, one of the English poets, the Dover Beach. Yes, that there's an ebb of the tide of the sea, where basically religion has moved away from the conception of society. So secularization as a philosophical so Prof. Alatas is very careful to distinguish between secularism as a secular state, like that, a state which is not ruled by, which is not a theocratic state, let's say. Why? He understood this precisely because in the 20th century, many Muslim activists trying to change things in legal terms, but focus on the challenge of of secularization as a philosophical program. If you wish to demand a right, then let it be the right of education. Yes, the right of educating yourself, the right of basically understanding nature as the ayat of God, the right of not having to succumb to the consecration of values and the desacralization of politics. Where the consecration of values is concerned, is to consider no values as sacred. But this is very interesting because if you consider no values sacred, and there is no sacred elements in politics, in truth, politics becomes just a realm of power. As you return back to the early challenge of the sophists, as in the Republic of Plato, he presented Socrates as trying to defend against the challenges of Thrasymachus, who was a sophist. Thrasymachus nonchalantly, even without, he's presented as showing that, unflinchingly, let's say, that he said that justice is might makes right. Justice is in the interest of the strong. And then of course, Socrates managed to find that there are some counter-examples to this. He said, even very powerful people, they try to present themselves as ethical. There's no power, no tyrant ever came to power by saying that I want to rule over you. And there's always some sort of vision that they present. And then secondly, he said, even amongst thieves, there is some sort of honor amongst thieves, because usually if you want to conduct yourself into a robbery, to organize them yourselves, at least you should not rob from each other. You should agree not to kill each other. Yes. That's why I think the Christopher Nolan's version of Batman is brilliant. I think the one with the Joker, because he presents in the first scene how even the honor amongst thieves is broken by if you have a truly wacky person, he may even understood this problem, honor among thieves. And then he said that also at the same time, the Socratic response was that, well, if it's truly might amongst right, there is no single individual who is powerful enough to rule all. And where the population is concerned, they must require some sort of agreement to follow, to adhere. And this became the basis of the modern Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes later. But all these questions by Socrates does not succeed. Yes, does not succeed to convince Thrasymachus. He understood that there is a problem in the thesis of might makes right. But he knew, he said that, well, why don't you present us with a theory of justice, and don't say that justice is It's the profitable. Don't say things like, don't give us a thesaurus sort of answer that justice is this and that. So basically, just using tautological means, give us a true meaning of justice. Socrates struggled, Plato struggled really, but Plato's response, if we see, is to resort to the metaphysical. He claimed that there would be a world of forms. Yes, and in the realm of forms, in the archetypal realm, there can only be one concept. And concepts of things are perfect things. They don't possess the corruptions of individual existentiated things. Yes, the idea of an elephant doesn't die like the elephant. The idea of an elephant cannot be removed of its tusks, and so on. So the idea of a perfect city, yes, is a city written in words. And then in the next chapter, I don't know what he was smoking. Suddenly, he proceeds to paint these things, assuming that he has knowledge of that. In truth, there is no claim. In truth, there is no access to that kind of realm. In truth, he said that even the method is it. He claims that the method to achieve this is dialectic. But how can dialectic arrive at this ultimate answer? You say this and I say that. Yes, and kada ana akul kada. It will never arrive at that notion of the perfect notion. Yes, but of course, as Alatas then later explains, this was because some of the ideas about justice, about the notion of the psychology of the human soul, these were already ideas that were floating around. And when you look at the Mediterranean in the 5th century BC, they were much more influenced by the realms of Egypt and what used to be the land of the prophets than it is today. They were much more connected to that realm. And it is not inconceivable that some of the teachings of Musa alayhi salam and other prophets who might be close to that period might have been floating around. It would have been changed to fit into their mold, but this basic system would be there. So walhasil, yes, if you speak about the deconsecration of values and the desacralization of politics, yes, then the notion of might makes right threatens to return to society. And this is why you have the notion of the homo sacer. Yes, homo sacer. Giorgio Agamben, he tried to develop these ideas from Michel Foucault and some of the 19th century political theorists. The notion that a homo sacer is an individual that like a persona non grata, like that, like a person who doesn't have rights in society. And these are usually people who suffer the fate of being refugees or the fate of being subhuman in that society. Yes, in which since officially they are not registered, or officially they possess less of the rights than the more naturalized citizens. Yes, therefore the sort of ethical things does not include. They are not included in the ethical circle. Yes, and this system of philosophy will emerge from every secularized system, beginning with Nietzsche. Yes, because he was amongst the first to have understood that Kant's ethics does not follow from his metaphysics. Immanuel Kant thought that metaphysically, in terms of knowledge, in terms of epistemology, you can have no access to metaphysics. It's impossible, Kant said, because the content of your mind only speaks about the content of your mind and not the external world. So since we have no experience of God, at least in pure reason, so therefore you can have no knowledge of God, you can have no knowledge of the afterlife, and even morality. So how then does Kant justify his ethics? He justified it in his practical philosophy. So in his critique of pure reason, he's already collapsed everything in the metaphysical sense. But in his practical ethics, yes, in his critique of practical reason, he wants to maintain everything as if nothing changed. So Kant imagined this notion of maxims in ethics. He said you should act as if your particular action is to be universalized. Nietzsche can already come back and say, but why? Isn't it? But why should you do that? Isn't it? You should act in a manner that your act should be universalized. The other maxim is, so basically he's lost the aqidah, but he wants to maintain the qawaid, fiqhiyah, like that. So everyone should be treated as an end rather than a means to an ends. But the loss of metaphysics, there's nothing there. So Nietzsche said, no, we should conceive a new ethics to answer the death of God, the problem of the death of God. Yes, to answer the problem of the death of God, because we've killed him with our own hands, metaphorically, we should become gods ourselves. So that's how gradually, yes, with the Nietzschean notion. Of course, people didn't like. Official philosophers tried to exorcise the ghost of Nietzsche. But every now and then it emerges in political systems. It emerged in Hitler's Germany. Yes, it emerges again in the rise of the politics of the far right now. Basically, it's at the back of everyone's mind that there would be a certain privileged class. And you need not be able to defend this ethically, because ultimately ethics is just what makes right. So you can understand now when you wish to Islamize knowledge, the implication is that yes, you would re-enchant nature so as to re-establish metaphysics, and the consequences would also be to re-sacralize politics, but not sacred in the mystical mythological sense, because Islamization desacralizes all false deities. It desacralizes all false political powers. The only power that becomes sacralized is the one that is rooted in the Sunnah, which is in turn only Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala's command. And in the consecration of values also, it consecrates all other values of human making, so as to return to the only value that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala has legislated. So that's Islamization of knowledge. And once we understood this larger background, we can understand not only the necessity but also the depth of this discourse, and that the real aim of the Islamization of knowledge process is not to produce textbooks. Yes, it's not to produce textbooks. It's not to prepare course lessons. Yes, it's not to bring about this industry of which would just replicate the modern university, except that you do a different thing. That sort of thing. But it is to return knowledge to its proper sense, to reinstitute the relationship between the student and the teacher, to reinstitute the proper notion of adab, and so on and so forth. Why don't we have a round of discussions?
If we expect to engage in a discourse with those who have subscribed to the philosophy of secularization, if we are to engage in a discourse with them, how are they expected to accept the idea of an ultimate truth as defined by God in order to have that same reference point that we can return to in order to have a discourse? Because if we don't agree on that point of reference, meaning the ultimate truth as defined by God, if they're not going to agree with that, how can we expect to engage in a discourse?
I think where philosophical debate is concerned, of course, even in the Quranic injunction, as وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, that we ought to debate in the best manner, like that. You have to establish the parameters that it's based on ethical conduct. It's not a game of shouting. And then once, supposing this basic ethics of agreement and disagreement is established, then I think one of the best methods to employ is I think the one that was employed by Imam Al-Ghazali in the Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad. It's called Sabar wa Taqsim. Meaning to say to have either or. Yes, to have either or, because you cannot have a third option. Really, in truth, there is only the Islamic worldview or the Western worldview. Yes. Now between these two, then you can proceed to draw your vision of reality in both senses. I think this is the most respectable discourse that can happen, as opposed to the regular debates that they used to have. Like is the Bible true, or does God exist, and so on and so forth. These sort of things, these sort of debates rarely achieve the desired outcomes of changing anyone. If anything, it only makes people more resolute in whatever that they happen to hold, because you do not have the same point of reference. It will be a person is defending from his point of reference and the other one like that. But here, in this proper debates, I think it has been done usually by philosophers. Usually they allow each other time to properly outline their thesis, properly outline their suppositions, and then allow for discourse. Meaning to say, like they used to do, I think there is a series of publications like Great Debates. One of them was between Alvin Plantinga and Tooley, one naturalist philosopher. So what they did was that they allowed Plantinga to write an essay of 70 pages or so to outline his own epistemology, where he tried to establish the existence of God, and then the other tries to explain his naturalistic standpoint, and then Plantinga responds by his criticism of the weaknesses of naturalism. That is, meaning to say, if we wish to have this at the highest levels, certainly. But at the common level of society, I think maybe sometimes it may not work if we try to do that. But it is sufficient, I think, if we are certain about our own about where we stand. So Al-Atas is not so much concerned about outlining the discrepancies and the internal contradictions of secularization, as much as he is trying to outline a credible vision of an Islamic metaphysics. And so long as you have that and you are certain, that's okay. And if you wish to proceed to discourse, then you try to underline the problems, the internal contradictions of secularization. Usually, however, it will also require an understanding of Western psychology. It is not that they do not admit that there is an internal contradiction in their worldview. In fact, that's where postmodernism is. Basically, they reject all narratives, including their own. They consider everything relative, including their own standpoint. And they understood that they understand the ephemeral nature of their ethics. That they understand that they will have to grudgingly allow their children to determine what is good for themselves, just as so long as they are given the freedom like that. So why is it that our discourse can still be more appealing? Because we assume and we affirm that there is something called fitra, and fitra inclines to truth. So that's how I think if we wish to improve on the discourse, it will proceed along these lines.
In order to move forward in discourse, would it be satisfactory for someone who cannot accept an ultimate truth as defined by God to say, well, let's assume for the sake of arguments what you're saying is true? Would it be satisfactory to adapt to that perspective in order to move forward? Meaning, even if you don't believe in God and you don't believe in an ultimate truth as determined by God, you can say, well, yes, I want to engage in this discourse, so for the sake of this discussion, let's assume this is true. Would that be satisfactory to move forward in a genuine discourse?
Well, this is the thing. The theologian and Prabharatas, as far as putting forth the metaphysics, he doesn't assume that he has anything up his sleeve to give hidayah to someone else. Yes, he doesn't assume like that. Maybe as a person, it's a different matter. Yes, sometimes they say what you need is a cup of coffee from the wali, like that. After very strong resistance, we see that in truth, this is Mutakallimin, Imam Taftazani, he said in response to the challenge of the Sufis, he said there are three principally. There are the La Adriya. The La Adriya are the skeptics, those who deny that we can have knowledge of everything, because they proceed from a critique of all the channels of knowledge. To this we can respond. Yes, and then there is the challenge of the India, the relativists. The relativist also understands and can be led to understand the weakness, yes, and the basically the internal contradictions, and perhaps can be convinced. Yes. But then there is a third category of sophists, and these are the inadiyah, the obstinate. And if you read in the books, what are we to do with the obstinate? So if you can burn them, we could. We mean in the afterlife, not arson. we're not trying to promote that. Meaning to say that sometimes
still the opportunity for discourse with this.
Meaning to say sometimes the opposition is a matter of disagreeing for the sake of disagreeing. To this, there's nothing that can be done. But of course, you can still win the. If your niyyah is right, your position is still defensible, and that I think is sufficient for public moral debate. That is sufficient. Yes, the public moral debate is not because we're not now talking about mau'izatul hasanah. We're not talking about hikmah. It's this ud'u ila sabili rabbikum in the higher sense, calling people unto Allah. This is the jadilhum billati hiya ahsan, to show that basically to drive them to the point that that indeed the akhirah will come. Indeed, there is Jannah and Nar. Indeed, these are positions that can establish yaqeen. But they say, oh, if they oppose it like that, then khalas, you would have done your task. So meaning to say, this already assumes the defensibility of your position, without necessarily but this is the amazing nature of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that despite giving the hujjah to many, he still desires for their guidance. لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ. When the disbelievers deny him, when they oppose him, their opposition to him, if we notice, was never because they had the superior argument. So we need to see the Prophet always had the clear argument. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always supplies the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with the clear argument, either in terms of the denial of the resurrection or its possibility, the unity of God, and the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad. To every argument that they brought against the Prophet, there was an answer. So that means to say that between the two systems, yes, shirk is clearly the false system. It was shown. But if they choose to persist, then you will find that those who remain persistent in their beliefs were people who are obstinate. They did so, and then it turns out, they would self-confess why they in fact oppose. And sometimes it's for really, when we think about it, childish reasons. Like I think Abu Jahl said, we used to be in competition with the Banu Hashim. They had this and we had this, and now they have a Nabi. We don't. So what sort of an argument is that? That would amount to saying things like, well, if I'm Nabi, then I will believe. And when they demand things like, why don't you send two prophets? Two prophets to two different villages, then I will believe. Or give the prophet some treasure, give him a garden, and then I will believe. These sort of arguments basically stem from that sort of arrogance that we need no longer address in that sense. But for a project, to build society along ethical lines, this. Remember, Al-Atas comes from that line of tradition, and his understanding of tradition in the Malay world, where already Islam was at the height of the specialized methodology, manhaj brought by Al-Faqih al-Muqaddam. This was already the initiation of a new period in history. The period in history where the da'i ilallah comes without the need of political support, without the need of military organization, and merely through the persuasiveness of argument and character, people become adherents. And this is also the blueprint that is suitable in our times, isn't it? And Muslims from all around the world. And this is also one of the blessings, because there is nothing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives except that it proceeds from His knowledge. And Imam Haddad used to say that you are in between the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As in between the two. And the hikmah of the removal of the Muslims institutions, urwatun urwa, as from the governments to all the structures, leaving the Muslim only with his salah, which is also his knowledge in that sense, is that you have nothing to lose really, to display your shahada now, and to defend the integrity of your faith in the societies that you come. And perhaps that is the process that will lead to the next phase in history. I haven't heard from you today.
I think actually the problem when we were speaking about earlier about temporalism, how they shifted from Aristotelianism to temporalism. So from my understanding, I thought Aristotelianism was that temporalism, and Plato was the.
Oh, okay, yes. When I say temporalism, meaning to say the emphasis on time. But Aristotle, in contrast to Plato, is not a debate between space and time. The debate between Aristotle and Plato is the debate between universals and particulars. And Aristotle, or rather Plato, advocated a metaphysics in which you incline towards the permanent archetypal realm, and Plato advocated a fourfold spectacles metaphysics. But the metaphysics is to be found in this world. These are the final, formal, material, and efficient causes. Final, formal, material, and efficient causes. No, but everything is in this world. The metaphysics is to be understood in this world. Meaning to say, either you look at a chair, and the material cause is the wood that's made, and then you have the final cause, which is the intention of the carpenter. The efficient cause is the action of the carpenter, and the formal cause is the shape of the chair. Yes. Do we need to posit a realm of forms for this? It is not necessary, according to Aristotle. It is not necessary also in the organic realm. He said in the tree, the acorn tends towards the oak tree. Yes, there is an internal proclivity towards arrival at the oak tree. There isn't a need to posit a realm, an archetypal realm in which oak trees exist. But before he promoted this metaphysics, he began with a criticism of one of the things about Plato's subtle but well-placed praise of his student, the young Aristotle. Imagine Aristotle would have been with Plato while Aristotle was in his 20s, and Plato perhaps nearly 80. But Aristotle is credited with the third man argument, that if you posit that there is an idea. Well, what about the idea of the idea, and at infinitum? But Plato himself really was the one who led to the self-destruction of his metaphysics, because he wrote the Republic and several of the metaphysics of this notion of archetypal realms while in his 40s. And in one of the later works, yes, the Parmenides, that's where he himself provided the criticism of this argument. So that's why, according to Bertrand Russell, Plato's Parmenides is one of the finest examples of self-criticism in Western philosophy. But Aristotle already started with that as a beginning point, so he tried to salvage whatever of Plato's metaphysics. But theirs, being the Greek metaphysics, is still bounded by the Parmenidean conception of being, and also the spatio-temporal conception of the spatial conception of reality, cyclical view of history, of that nature. But when the Judeo element was introduced, yes, it began with this notion that there will be a better life to come, and we should struggle for that. Eventually, this is greatness. It's not going to be in the akhirah. You want Zion here in the world. You achieve it in the future. Your grandchildren will get that. So once that happens, this is that's why you have newspapers which are called Times. And everything is in the here and now, and they look to some brighter future. But this, let us say, cult of progress. I think after sufficient blunders, they come to become, depressed and anxious. There isn't going to be that bright future. I think ever since the 60s, in truth, their own lack of achievements, because in the 19th century, achievement, because science proceeds via cumulative efforts, the big achievements were easier to achieve, were easier to grasp. Like with Newton, you can discover very basic things, like you can discover that there's inertia, you can discover force and its principles and so on. With Einstein, he's looking at one particular aspect. With Stephen Hawking, it's very difficult to explain to another person what his achievement was already, isn't it? Because it's cumulative, and there's now so many people working within the system. But despite more and more people working within the system, there surely is a limit of the paradigm that they have, and already they are questioning in terms of the philosophy of science. That's why Prof. Alaka said we need to establish our own philosophy of science. This Feyerabend and Thomas Kuhn and all these other philosophers of science, their paradigms just don't do. The notion that every scientist works within a paradigm until sufficient anomalies occur before a new paradigm can replace that. That simply won't do anymore, isn't it? Because within the present paradigm, now you have to spend billions, for the colliders. And then you have to take up so much resources for space travel. Eventually, their imagination has taken them to further and further away. Planets which are in terms of light years, but their technology is not sufficient for that, and they will realize their resources will not be sufficient for that. Eventually, it will be time for dystopias. Eventually, it will be time for they have to return to the Earth. And when they do that, that's when they return to this existentialist angst. And every now and then, when tragic circumstances surround them, they will realize that the tragedy will not be enough. That's what happened in the early 20th century. Suddenly, you find a surge in existentialist philosophy, when you can have Camus, asking, so the only and the most important question in philosophy is, why shouldn't I kill myself? But we understand that life must be suffering for a person to ask that. I don't think it would ever occur to any Tarim, to ask that question. And a person who's brought up upon the fitrah, they will never question that. It's never a question. But if the foundation of life is suffering, that would be a foundational question. And they return again. And of course, that angst sometimes is answered through suicide. But in those with a more violent disposition, it leads to sparagmos, which is a more dangerous sort of explosion, where you decide to just go on a killing spree like that. Can we have your last word, please? Maybe a reflection, at least.
Nujal said that there's actually a benefit when you sit and take things. I don't really have anything to say.
Maybe biggest takeaway?
Sorry?
Biggest takeaway?
Just something I reflect on, something I perhaps recently as well, the idea of the obstinacy that you were talking about. Just a reflection, something that I heard recently from Shabbat. area the West faces, in their like quest for what is the meaning of life, and is that truth happens to be in a place that they don't expect it to be, in the downtrodden Eastern religion, which they've colonized, they've overpowered, but that's where the truth happens to be. He gave this completely, like, blew my mind away anyway. He said that the myth of the Holy Grail, the origins are actually in Islam. He says the Holy Grail is actually the Hajj al-Aswad.
Mashallah.
You know, and he said, and if they, you know, there's this whole mythology around it, you know, quests, going to certain parts of Europe and other thing, and, you know, holy lands and everything, look for it. And it's there, it's hiding in plain sight. You can go to it, you can kiss it, you can touch it if you want, but you just have to say a few words in Arabic. And that's the big, that's what's so tough on the nurse. And, you know, examples that he gives was like, we can go to Mount Doom and, you know, fight a black dragon. We can deal with all that stuff, but just saying a few Arabic words, that's too heavy on the soul.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what it comes down, as you said, it's our in terms of Islamic tradition. If we just have those things, we understand where we're coming from, we're rooted in our metaphysics, then you can have a dialogue with people until you come to a stage where it's just inert.
Yeah.
It was the inert of the Quraysh.
Yes.
They knew exactly what it was. And the Prophet came with the truth. That what he said was true, intrinsically. That it was just too much to accept. It was too heavy on the nafs. You know, and perhaps that's what now the West is. Western civilization is finding difficult to continue.
You know, there is one scholar who's dear to Professor Atas, who studied in his time with him, who visited him often. But he returned to the West for some time. He started teaching. Then, you know, in one of the, when he came back and he did talk about Professor Atas, one of the students asked him, you know, what do you think of this notion of the permanent confrontation between Islam and the West? He made this statement offhand, of course. He said, perhaps it was a reflection of the 60s and 70s, where Islam was in confrontation with the West. He said, in truth, there is no confrontation with Western culture per se, like that. You know, then he came to visit Ramadan. He said, no, it's permanent. And certainly because he's defined it in such a way that it is not he's not writing it as an, you know, in the words of some of the social scientists who misunderstood Al-Atas, they say that Al-Atas is a anti-Orientalist, brought up on the methodology and the tools of the Orientalists, but using the tools against the West. But this is a caricature, it's a mischaracterization of Al-Atas, because unlike some of the reformists and the modernists who did use the methodological tools in order to fight the West, but end up you know, shooting themselves in the foot, Al-Atas is exploring and bringing the West to the limits of the epistemic tools, and show the West that in truth you have not used your epistemology properly. That while you claim to have a superior scientific method, you suffer from methodological cleavages. Yes. While you claim to have developed the tools that will almost infinitely, let us say, infinitely magnify your sphere of vision and your ability to hear and your ability to measure, but you have not activated the most powerful tool within you, which is the heart and spirit. Al-Atas gives this analogy, you know, like there is supposing a series of concentric spheres with an aperture in the middle of each of the spheres. Yes, and they are all consistently turning like that. At the end of that is the light of the sun. That's it. What is needed is for the apertures to align, yes, in one direction, in order that the light of the sun can reach your point. And once the light of the sun touches you, it would reveal everything around you already. He speaks this about the heart. The heart of man is the most powerful epistemic tool that Allah has given. لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. Yes? And if they can understand the place of the qalb as the spiritual organ of cognition, it will solve all the epistemic problems. It will tell them who they are. It will lead them to knowledge of God. Yes? Yes, it requires an empiricism, but the subject of the empiricism is themselves. And this is why it's difficult, isn't it? Because they need to overcome their lust, they need to overcome their nafs, they need to subject themselves to religious duties. They need to begin with the zawahir and the bidayah of hidayah before they can be given the nihayah. But what they are after is the nihayah, and so Professor Abbas, in order to meet the challenge, that's why he gives, he gives just sufficient amount in the philosophy of science, just the sufficient amount. What is the definition of kashf? What is the definition of mushahadah, mu'ayana with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He gives just the sufficient definition, the sufficient of what is it to experience al-jama' wal-farq. And once he explains all these things, he said, that individual scientists who contemplate all their lives on a particular aspect of phenomenon may achieve through their juhud, with the generosity of God, unveilings onto particular aspects of nature. So that's why some of them, have their eureka moments. Some of them can, in their dreams, yes. How can you prepare to achieve some truth in your dreams? Yes, but yet you don't thank Allah. Yes. They achieve in their dreams. They see the particular, the particular arrangement or configuration of a molecule or a chemical property. They see it in their dreams. They say that, how can they see it's their effort? They see it in their dreams. Similarly, another person, while he's laying down in his bathtub, he arrives at a eureka moment. But precisely, it's a eureka moment. It is not your effort. And another one, although more anecdotal, that as he sits and lies down, he sees an apple falling down and then it clicks. But who causes this click? Yes? How can you prepare for the click? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is kind to them, yes, in the Rahman sense, but in the Rahim sense, yes, in the details of the Rahmah, it is only for the Ibadahul Mukhlasin. And in these particular individuals, they unveil what reality is all about. The true and real speaks to them directly in the Mushahadah, in Wujud. And Allah said, that with respect to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his chapter on the philosophy of science, he's talking about the philosophy of science, and in that chapter he said, with regards to the sacred personality of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he does not merely communicate the truth, he constitutes the truth. ليس هو يحكي الكلام عن الحق بل هو. Now we understand that basically Al-Atas is one of the masters of tasawwuf, but it just so happens that he clothes it with the ulum al-zahir of our times. In the same way that Abdullah bin Muhsin described Abdullah bin Alam al-Haddad. He said that Imam al-Haddad's knowledge is all Wahbi. It's all Wahbi. And he indicates it in the beginnings of every risala. Every risala Imam al-Haddad begins with Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Yes. He said that he clothes it with the ulum zahir, but in truth everything is Wahbi. That's why you can read it without a shame. Wahbi, meaning it's a gift. Everything is given to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The arrangement, the content, everything is Allah's words. Yes.
Again, it comes from hiding things like he's just set up Ali and passed away just a few years ago.
Okay.
Lived over 100, and was known as a faqih. And they would say about him, he was like the highest degrees of wilayah. They even say about like some of the well-known habaib, like even they say they يتستر بظهوره. It's عجيب, يعني he conceals himself by being known. Because you're like, okay, I want to know who the hidden awliya, I want to know someone that's kind of, this kind of almost fetish that we have, like, I want to know. It's like, no, you see the one that's saying, Ya Allah, yeah, no, he's the, yeah. No, but everyone knows him. يتستر بظهوره. وهكذا يعني سيد محمد نقيب as well. التستر في
Yeah, he uses the language of science.
Right. People say, oh, he's just academic in the Western tradition or something like that, yeah. But like, even through his writings, you can see the anfas. As I said to you at a time where you read through it, and this is someone who is very much Ash'ari in his aqidah. Like, he may not say it in his, but whenever he gives examples or he expounds on points, this is someone who's well rooted in the theological tradition. And even when even the conceptualization of secularism as well, even like he's very much in line with when he talks about Al-Maniyya. He's not talking about the Western notion of secularization, which is the separation of church and state, but this idea of a more universal idea of separating the sacred and the profane. It's all, the believer sees everything through his ubudiyya to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't know whether he's in the realm, when he's ruling, whether he's on the street, or anything. That's separating that, this idea. And unfortunately, a lot of Muslims, I can speak of studies, that we've adopted this secular, someone might be openly observant, attends the masjid, prays, does everything. But when it comes to his dealings in business, it's like, oh no, that's my work, that's my business. That's secularism. That's when we understand it traditionally. Has no problem with certain financial transactions or dealing with sources which we in our tradition we would consider unethical. To kind of have that and still kind of be like, no, when it comes to my ibadah and my food, it's all halal and haram, but then I can kind of cheat the system or maybe bend the rules a little bit when I'm dealing with people. That's the secularization which is blameworthy in our tradition.
Or even become a deity myself by determining what is ethical.
It's almost 100, isn't it? Can we have a Fatiha from you, Brother Shaykh? اللهم نحن الفاتحة بأن الله يتقبل منا وبأن الله ينفعنا ويباركنا بما علم وأوهب إلى أوليائه الصالحين المتقين بأن الله يلحقنا بهم وبأن الله ينور قلوبنا وقوالبنا معه والهدى والعفاف والغنى والموت على دين الإسلام والإيمان بالله والامتحان بحق سيد ولا ولكل نية صالحة وإلى حضرة النبي محمد